May 2nd, 1878, Minneapolis, Minnesota, 7 o'clock in the evening. The Washburn A Mill stands 6 stories tall on the banks of the Mississippi River, its limestone walls glowing amber in the fading spring light. Inside, 14 men work the night shift, surrounded by the rhythmic thunder of millstones grinding wheat into flour. The air is thick with it, fine white particles suspended in every breath, coating every surface, drifting through shafts of dying sunlight like snow that never falls. At 7:10 p.m., somewhere in the lower levels of that building, a spark finds fuel. What happens next takes less than 3 seconds. The flour dust hanging in the air ignites. Not a fire, an explosion. The force is so violent it lifts the entire 6-story building off its foundation. Stone walls that have stood for 4 years disintegrate into shrapnel. The roof launches skyward like a lid blown off a pot. Windows in buildings half a mile away shatter inward. People standing on the streets of Minneapolis watch in horror as the largest flour mill in the world simply ceases to exist. But the Washburn A is not alone. The blast wave tears through the neighboring Humboldt Mill, then the Diamond, then the Zenith. Mill after mill detonates in a chain reaction that turns the riverfront into a war zone. Within seconds, 5 of the largest flour mills on Earth are gone. 18 men are dead. Some of them vaporize so completely that their families will never have bodies to bury. The thing that fed America had just revealed that it could also blow America apart. This is the story of the deadliest industrial explosion in American history. A disaster so catastrophic it changed everything about how we mill grain, how we think about dust, and how we count the cost of the bread on our table. But to understand how 18 men died in 3 seconds, you first need to understand why Minneapolis became the flour capital of the world, and why the men who worked these mills walked into buildings that were, quite literally, bombs waiting to go off. Let's go back. The Mississippi River drops about 50 feet at the Falls of St. Anthony, and that's not much by waterfall standards. Niagara drops over 160, but those 50 feet at St. Anthony are some of the most valuable feet of falling water in American history. Because when water falls, it can turn wheels. When wheels turn, they can grind grain. And in the decades after the Civil War, America was hungry. The population was exploding westward. Railroads were stitching the continent together. And all those new Americans needed bread. Enormous quantities of bread. The demand was so fierce that whoever could mill flour, fastest, cheapest, and in the greatest volume would become fabulously wealthy. But there was a problem: the wheat. The Great Plains of Minnesota and the Dakotas were producing unprecedented quantities of grain. The soil was perfect. The climate was ideal. Farmers were shipping trainload after trainload of wheat to Minneapolis for processing. But this wasn't the same wheat that millers back east had been grinding for generations. This was spring wheat, a harder variety with higher protein content and a tougher outer bran layer. Back east, millers ground soft winter wheat that practically fell apart between millstones. Spring wheat was different. It fought back. Traditional milling techniques that had worked for centuries produced flour that was darker, speckled with bran fragments, and considered inferior by consumers who prized pure white flour as a sign of quality and refinement. The wheat was magnificent. The flour was mediocre. And that gap between potential and reality was driving millers in Minneapolis crazy. Enter Cadwallader Colden Washburn. Washburn was a Maine-born politician, Civil War general, and businessman who saw what others missed. He looked at those falls, looked at the wheat pouring out of the Minnesota plains, and understood that Minneapolis was sitting on a gold mine. Not actual gold, something more valuable, in 1870s America. The potential to produce the finest white flour on Earth, if only someone could figure out how to unlock it. Washburn invested heavily in new technology from Europe. He hired engineers, consulted with milling experts, and spent what his competitors considered ridiculous sums on experimental machinery. What he was pursuing was a process called gradual reduction, which used steel rollers instead of traditional millstones to break down the wheat kernel in stages. See, the problem with traditional millstones was that they crushed everything at once. Bran, germ, and endosperm all got ground together and mixed together, but gradual reduction approached the kernel like a surgeon. First pass took off the outer bran layer, second pass cracked the kernel. Third pass separated the white endosperm from the golden germ. Each stage was precise, controlled, and could be adjusted for different types of wheat. Combined with machines called middlings purifiers that used air currents and vibrating screens to separate different grades of flour by weight, Washburn's mills could produce something unprecedented: pure, white, consistent flour from spring wheat. The same hard wheat that had stymied other millers became his greatest advantage, because spring wheat flour, when properly milled, had more protein than winter wheat flour. It made better bread, stronger gluten, higher rise, superior texture. In 1874, Washburn opened the Washburn Mill. And when I tell you this building was something, I need you to understand the scale we're talking about. The Washburn A was the largest flour mill in the world. 6 stories of limestone and brick, powered directly by the falls through an elaborate system of turbines and shafts. The building could grind over 2 million pounds of wheat into flour every single day. To put that in perspective, a single day's output from the Washburn A could make roughly 1.5 million loaves of bread. Every day, day after day, week after week, the machinery inside was the most advanced in the industry. Rows of steel rollers that had replaced the old millstones, purifiers that hummed and vibrated as they sorted flour by fineness, conveyor systems that moved grain through the building in a continuous flow from receiving to shipping. Everything was optimized for speed, for volume, for the relentless conversion of raw wheat into refined flour. But the Washburn A wasn't alone. Clustered along the riverbank were dozens of mills, all racing to meet demand. The Humboldt Mill stood adjacent to the Washburn A, so close their workers could wave to each other through windows. The Diamond Mill rose nearby, the Zenith, the Galaxy, each one a massive industrial operation, each one filled with state-of-the-art machinery, each one employing dozens of men who worked in conditions that would be considered criminal by modern standards. Let me tell you about those conditions, because understanding them is essential to understanding what happened on May 2nd, 1878. When wheat is ground into flour, it doesn't produce just flour. It produces dust. Enormous quantities of fine white powder that rise from the millstones and rollers in continuous clouds. This dust drifts through the building, settles on every surface, and hangs suspended in the air for hours at a time. In the Washburn A, the concentration of airborne flour was so high that workers sometimes struggled to see clearly across a room. The building interior existed in a permanent white haze, a fine mist of wheat particles that never fully settled. The men who worked in these conditions breathed that dust with every breath. It coated their lungs, their sinuses, their throats. When they blew their noses, white paste came out. When they coughed up flour. Their clothes were white with it when they got home. Their skin took on a pale, powdery quality that wouldn't wash off, no matter how hard they scrubbed. Long-term workers developed what they called miller's cough, a chronic wheeze that got worse over the years as their lungs slowly clogged with accumulated flour particles. You could identify a veteran miller by his breathing, that rattling, labored sound that accompanied every exhalation, that pause between sentences while he gathered enough air to continue speaking. Some men worked until they couldn't breathe anymore. They would spend their final years gasping for air in small apartments while their families struggled to survive without their wages. Too sick to work, too poor to retire, watching their children go hungry while their lungs slowly hardened into useless masses of flour-soaked tissue. The lucky ones died of something else first. The noise inside these mills was equally punishing. The thunder of millstones grinding wheat, the rumble of conveyors moving grain, the whine of belts, and the clatter of machinery. Men working side by side often couldn't hear each other shout. They communicated through gestures, through taps on the shoulder, through a language of signals developed over years of shared labor. And the heat. Flour milling generates tremendous heat through friction. The millstones themselves could become hot enough to burn bare skin. The air inside the building, already thick with dust, also carried that dry, baking warmth. In summer, temperatures inside the mill could exceed 100 degrees. Men would strip to their undershirts and still drip with sweat, their skin coated in a paste of perspiration and flour dust. This was the daily reality of flour milling in 1878. Hard labor in brutal conditions for wages that barely kept families fed. But these jobs were treasured. These jobs were competed for. These jobs were the best opportunity many men would ever have. But nobody worried about the dust-catching fire. Why would they? Flour didn't burn? You could drop a match on a pile of flour, and it would just smolder, maybe char a little. It wouldn't explode. The danger seemed purely respiratory. Annoying, perhaps. Unhealthy, certainly. But not deadly in any immediate way. What nobody understood was that it wasn't the flour on the floor that was dangerous. It was the flour in the air. Here's what you need to understand about dust explosions, because this is the science that killed 18 men in 3 seconds. Any material that can burn in bulk will explode when it's finely divided and suspended in air. This isn't obvious, it's actually counterintuitive. We think of explosions as requiring explosive materials, gunpowder, dynamite, things that are inherently unstable. But dust explosions work on a completely different principle. Think about fire for a moment. Fire is a chemical reaction between fuel and oxygen that releases heat and light. The reaction happens at the surface of the fuel, where it meets the oxygen in the air. When you have a log in a fireplace, fire can only reach the outside surface. The inside of the log is protected by the outer layers. Combustion happens gradually, inch by inch, as the surface burns away. But what happens when you pulverize that log into sawdust and suspend it in the air? Suddenly, every particle is all surface. There's no inside to protect. Every point on every particle is exposed to oxygen simultaneously. When combustion starts, it doesn't have to work its way inward. It happens everywhere at once. And when combustion happens everywhere at once, it's not a fire anymore. It's an explosion. The pressure wave from a dust explosion can exceed 50 pounds per square inch. For comparison, a car tire is inflated to about 35 pounds per square inch. Imagine that pressure suddenly generated throughout an entire building in a fraction of a second. Walls that weren't designed to withstand that kind of force simply fail. They blow outward. The building tears itself apart from the inside. Flour dust, when suspended in air at concentrations between about 40 and 4,000 grams per cubic meter, becomes one of the most explosive substances on Earth. More explosive than gunpowder by volume. More dangerous than coal dust. Because flour is pure energy, pure carbohydrates, just waiting for a spark, and flour mills produced astronomical quantities of this dust. Every time a kernel of wheat passed through the millstones, it released a puff of fine particles. Every time flour moved through a chute or conveyor, it shed a cloud of dust. The milling process itself was continuously generating fresh fuel for a catastrophic explosion. And because the mills operated around the clock to meet demand, that fuel was always present, always building, always reaching toward that critical concentration. Inside the Washburn A, investigators later estimated that the flour dust concentration regularly exceeded the minimum explosive threshold. Not occasionally, regularly. The building spent most of its operating hours in a state where any spark could trigger total destruction. The men working inside were surrounded by explosive atmosphere as a normal condition of their employment. And there were plenty of potential sparks. The millstones themselves could strike each other when grain flow interrupted momentarily. When that happened, steel touched stone and tiny sparks flew. The massive belt-driven machinery that transferred power throughout the building could generate friction. Bearings could overheat. Static electricity built up constantly as grain flowed through chutes and conveyors, sometimes discharging invisible crackling sparks. Oil lamps provided light in darker corners of the building. Even the nails in workers' boots could strike sparks against stone floors. Every day, the men of the Washburn A walked into a building where explosive fuel hung in the air they breathed, where ignition sources surrounded them on all sides, and where a single spark could turn the entire structure into a bomb. They didn't know it. They couldn't have known it. The science of dust explosions was barely understood even by experts. The workers just knew the air was thick and their lungs hurt. They walked into that building every day anyway. because the alternative was poverty. And in 1878 Minneapolis, a milling job was one of the best jobs a working man could get. $14 a week. That's what the Washburn A paid. Enough to support a family, enough to rent a decent apartment, enough to put food on the table and maybe save a little for the future. In an era when many workers earned half that, a job at Washburn's mill was something to be proud of. The work was hard. 12-hour shifts in heat and noise and endless clouds of dust. Heavy lifting, constant attention required to keep the machinery running smoothly. But it was steady work, reliable work, work that put you in the same building as the most advanced milling technology on Earth, working for a man whose name was synonymous with success. Now let me tell you about May 2nd, 1878. It was a Thursday. Spring had finally arrived in Minneapolis after a brutal winter that had kept temperatures below zero for weeks at a time. The evening was mild and pleasant, around 60 degrees, with a light breeze coming off the river. The kind of evening that made you glad to be alive, glad that winter was over, glad that summer was coming. The day shift at the Washburn A had been productive. Thousands of bushels of wheat had been ground into flour, packed into barrels, and loaded onto wagons for transport to waiting railroad cars. The machinery had run smoothly, without breakdowns or delays. Just another successful day of operation for the most productive flour mill on Earth. Around 7 o'clock, the night shift arrived to take over. 14 men clocked in that evening. Let me tell you about some of them, because they deserve to be more than just numbers. George Robinson was the head miller, responsible for overseeing operations and ensuring the machinery ran smoothly. He was a veteran of the milling trade, with decades of experience grinding grain. He knew the sound of healthy machinery and the feel of properly ground flour. He had survived countless minor accidents over the years, burns from steam pipes, fingers caught in gears, the everyday dangers of industrial work that everyone accepted as normal. George Robinson was 51 years old. Joseph Cohn had immigrated from Germany seeking opportunity in America. He sent money home to family members still in the old country, hoping eventually to bring them all to Minneapolis. He was learning English, trying to improve himself, working the night shift because that's where the jobs were for newcomers. Joseph Cohn was 34 years old. William Fogarty was Irish, part of the massive wave of immigration that had transformed American cities in the decades after the Great Famine. He had a wife and 3 children who depended on his wages. He had been at the Washburn A for 2 years and had never had a serious accident. William Fogarty was 28 years old. Albert Mann was young, just 22. He had only started at the mill a few months earlier and was still learning the trade. The older workers teased him about his questions, but they also taught him, passing down knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. Albert Mann was saving up to get married. John Sheridan, Thomas Nash, Emil Kroll, Charles Thompson, Frank Gessner. I could continue. 14 names, 14 lives, 14 men who said goodbye to their families that evening, walked down to the riverfront, and took their positions throughout the Washburn A for what they expected would be another ordinary shift. The machinery started up. The millstones began their endless grinding. Flour rose into the air in the same white clouds that had filled the building since the day it opened. At 7:10 p.m., something sparked. We'll never know exactly what caused the ignition. The force of the explosion was so total, so absolutely devastating, that it destroyed all evidence of its own origin. But investigators later developed 2 main theories. The first theory centered on the millstones. In normal operation, grain constantly flowed between the stones, cushioning them from direct contact. But if that flow interrupted even momentarily, due to a blockage or irregular feeding, the stones could strike each other. When that happened, tiny sparks flew. Usually these sparks were harmless, dying instantly in air that wasn't heavily laden with combustible dust. But if the spark happened at the wrong moment, in the wrong place, with the dust at the wrong concentration. The second theory focused on the machinery. The Washburn A used an elaborate system of belts and pulleys to transfer power from the turbines to the individual machines. These belts generated friction. They could wear unevenly. Bearings could run hot. Any of these conditions could potentially generate a spark. Either way, something happened, something tiny, something that would have been harmless in any other environment. A spark measured in fractions of an inch, burning for a fraction of a second. But this environment was different. The spark found flour dust. The dust ignited. And what happened next defied everything those men could have understood about the world they lived in. The initial explosion probably occurred somewhere in the lower levels of the building, near the millstones. A fireball bloomed outward at incredible speed, consuming the flour dust in its path and generating tremendous pressure. That pressure wave slammed into other pockets of suspended dust throughout the building, igniting them in turn. Within a fraction of a second, simultaneous explosions were occurring on every level of the Washburn A. The building didn't burn, it detonated. 6 stories of limestone and brick, one of the largest flour mills on Earth, was torn apart from the inside out. The force lifted the massive structure bodily off its foundation. Walls that had stood for 4 years blew outward in every direction. The roof rocketed skyward, tumbling through the air before crashing back to Earth hundreds of feet away. Machinery weighing tons was hurled through the air like children's toys. The massive millstones, each weighing thousands of pounds, were thrown clear of the wreckage, and 14 men were killed so instantly that none of them would have had time to understand what was happening. The pressure wave moved faster than human nervous systems can process sensation. The men of the Washburn A felt nothing. One moment they were working, the next moment they were gone. But the catastrophe was only beginning. The Humboldt Mill stood adjacent to the Washburn A, separated by perhaps 50 feet. When the A exploded, the blast wave tore through the Humboldt's windows, carrying with it burning debris and superheated air. The Humboldt was full of its own flour dust, its own explosive atmosphere, its own bomb, waiting for a trigger. The burning debris provided that trigger. The Humboldt Mill exploded. 2 more men died instantly. The diamond mill was next. Its walls, weakened by the shock waves from 2 previous explosions, couldn't withstand the pressure when its own dust ignited. The building came apart, burying its workers under tons of rubble and burning machinery. 2 more men died. Within seconds, what had started as a single spark in a single building had become a chain reaction that devastated the Minneapolis riverfront. The Zenith Mill went next. Then part of the Galaxy. 5 massive mills were destroyed or severely damaged. Fires broke out among the wreckage, feeding on the flour and grain that had spilled from shattered storage bins. The night sky over Minneapolis lit up with an orange glow visible for miles. People standing on streets throughout the city felt the ground shake. Windows shattered in buildings half a mile away. The sound of the explosions echoed off buildings and rolled across the prairie like thunder. And 18 men were dead. The chaos that followed the explosion defied description. Workers from nearby buildings rushed toward the destroyed mills, hoping to find survivors. But there was no organization, no coordination, no training for this kind of disaster. Minneapolis in 1878 had no professional fire department, no emergency response protocols, no system for managing mass casualties. Volunteer firefighters arrived within minutes, but they faced an impossible situation. Multiple buildings were burning simultaneously. Rubble blocked access to potential survivors. The ruins were still collapsing, still settling, still dangerous. Every attempt to search for survivors risked killing the rescuers. Men waded into wreckage that was still collapsing, into fires that were still burning, into air thick with smoke and flour dust, and the smell of burned grain and burned flesh. They tore at rubble with bare hands, pulling aside stones and timbers and twisted machinery, calling out names into the darkness, praying for any response. The fires burned through the night, orange flames leaping from mill to mill, consuming flour and grain and the bodies of men who would never be found. Bucket brigades formed along the riverfront, passing water hand to hand in a futile attempt to contain the conflagration. But there was too much fuel, too much destruction, too little hope. The first rescuers quickly discovered the horrible truth. There were no survivors in the Washburn A. The explosion had been too complete, too total. The men who had been inside the building simply didn't exist anymore in any recognizable form. What the rescuers found instead were fragments, pieces, remains that would take days to recover and weeks to identify. Some of the bodies were never identified at all. The explosion had been so devastating that it hadn't just killed men, it had unmade them. Coroners working in the days after the disaster struggled to match remains to names. Families waited desperately for news, hoping their loved ones might somehow have survived, knowing in their hearts that hope was impossible. William Fogarty's wife received word on May 4th that her husband's body had been found. The funeral was closed casket. What remained of William Fogarty would not have been recognizable to the children he left behind. Albert Mann, the young worker who had been saving for his wedding, was identified only by a ring on a recovered hand. George Robinson, the veteran head miller, was found near where he had been standing when the spark ignited. His experience had not saved him. Nothing could have saved anyone in that building. The funerals began on May 5th and continued for days. Black crepe hung from buildings throughout Minneapolis. Church bells tolled. Ministers struggled to find words adequate to the loss. How do you eulogize 18 men killed in 3 seconds? How do you comfort families whose loved ones have been reduced to fragments? How do you explain to a child that their father walked into work and simply ceased to exist? Some families couldn't afford proper funerals. Some families couldn't afford coffins. The Millers Union did what it could, passing a hat, collecting donations. Cadwallader Washburn himself contributed to a relief fund. But money couldn't restore what had been taken. Money couldn't bring back George Robinson or Joseph Cohn or William Fogarty or Albert Mann. Money could only help the survivors survive a little longer. The investigation into the Washburn A explosion began almost immediately. This wasn't just about understanding what had happened. This was about preventing it from happening again. Because every flour mill in Minneapolis, every flour mill in America, had the same conditions as the Washburn A. The same dust, the same potential for disaster, the same men working inside buildings that could detonate at any moment. The investigation was unprecedented in scope and thoroughness. Engineers, scientists, and industry experts descended on Minneapolis to examine the evidence and interview survivors from nearby buildings. What they found revolutionized understanding of industrial safety. The investigation confirmed the science of dust explosions with new precision. Researchers calculated the minimum dust concentration required for ignition. They measured the pressure generated by various dust concentrations. They identified the conditions that made explosions most likely and the interventions that could prevent them. The findings were damning. The Washburn A had been operating in explosive conditions essentially continuously. The lack of ventilation had allowed dust to accumulate to dangerous levels. The absence of any dust collection system had meant that fresh fuel was constantly being added to the atmosphere. The presence of multiple ignition sources, from millstones to friction to static electricity, meant that disaster was not just possible but inevitable. Only the timing had been uncertain. This conclusion forced the milling industry to confront an uncomfortable truth. The same processes that made mills profitable were also making them deadly. The fine flour that consumers demanded required grinding that produced explosive dust. The continuous operation that maximized output meant continuous production of that explosive fuel. The lack of ventilation that kept product loss low allowed concentrations to build to catastrophic levels. Something had to change. And because of what happened in Minneapolis on May 2, 1878, something did. Cadwallader Washburn, to his credit, didn't abandon Minneapolis. He didn't close his operations and walk away from the destruction his mill had caused. He didn't blame the workers or claim the disaster was unpredictable or try to avoid responsibility. Instead, he committed to rebuilding. But not just rebuilding. He committed to rebuilding safely. Within 2 years, a new Washburn A mill rose on the same site where 18 men had died. But this building was different. This building incorporated every lesson learned from the disaster. And those lessons would spread throughout the milling industry and transform it completely. The first and most important innovation was dust control. The new Washburn A featured an elaborate system of dust collectors, fans, and air handling equipment designed to prevent flour dust from ever accumulating in the air to dangerous concentrations. Fresh air was constantly circulated through the building. Dust was captured at its source near the millstones and rollers and removed through ductwork before it could spread. The captured dust was processed separately and added back to lower grades of flour or sold as animal feed. Nothing was wasted, but nothing was allowed to accumulate in the working atmosphere. For the first time in the history of flour milling, workers could see clearly across the room. For the first time, they weren't breathing paste with every breath. The perpetual white haze that had defined flour milling since the invention of the millstone simply didn't exist in the new Washburn A. The second innovation was compartmentalization. The new mill was divided into isolated sections, each separated from the others by fire-resistant barriers. If an explosion did occur in one section, it couldn't propagate throughout the building the way it had in the original Washburn A. The chain reaction that had turned one spark into 5 destroyed mills was no longer possible. The third innovation was improved purification technology. The new Middlings purifiers were more efficient than their predecessors, producing better flour with less dust, and the entire process was enclosed in ways that prevented flour from escaping into the general atmosphere. The new Washburn A opened in 1880. It never exploded. Neither did its successors, the innovations pioneered in Minneapolis after the disaster spread throughout the industry. Within a generation, the kind of conditions that had existed in the original Washburn A, the clouds of dust, the perpetual haze, the bomb waiting to detonate, became relics of a more dangerous past. But let's be clear about something. These changes didn't happen because the milling industry suddenly developed a conscience. They happened because the disaster forced them to happen. Before May 2, 1878, mill owners had no idea their buildings were dangerous in this specific way. After May 2, 1878, they couldn't pretend ignorance anymore. The science was established. The deaths were documented. Anyone who failed to implement safety measures was now knowingly putting workers at risk, and knowingly killing workers was bad for business. The economic pressure, combined with growing labor organization and public awareness, pushed the industry towards safety faster than any appeal to morality ever could have. Within decades, American flour mills went from being death traps to being relatively safe industrial workplaces. Not perfectly safe, industrial accidents still happened. They still happen today. But the kind of catastrophic building-leveling explosion that killed 18 men in Minneapolis became vanishingly rare. Meanwhile, the company Washburn built kept growing. The Washburn-Crosby Company, as it became known, continued to expand after the disaster. It acquired other mills, developed new products, and became one of the dominant forces in American food production. In 1928, Washburn-Crosby merged with several other milling companies to form General Mills. You might recognize that name. Today, General Mills is one of the largest food companies in the world. Their products are in essentially every American kitchen. Cheerios, Betty Crocker, Pillsbury, Haagen-Dazs. The company that was born on the banks of the Mississippi, that pioneered new milling technology, that rebuilt after one of the worst industrial disasters in American history, is now a $100 billion global corporation. The original site of the Washburn A explosion is now part of the Mill City Museum, a registered historic landmark where tourists can learn about the history of milling in Minnesota. The ruins of some of the original mills have been preserved, their stone walls standing as monuments to an era when the flour that fed America also killed the men who made it, and almost nobody remembers what happened there. Almost nobody remembers the 18 men who died in 3 seconds on a May evening in 1878. Almost nobody knows that the flour in their pantry is descended from processes refined in the aftermath of catastrophic violence. Almost nobody connects their morning toast to George Robinson and Joseph Cohn and William Fogarty and the other men who paid for America's daily bread with their lives. But you know now. And I want you to sit with that knowledge for a moment. Because here's the thing about industrial disasters. They're never random. They're never acts of God or freak accidents or unpredictable catastrophes. They're the predictable result of systems that prioritize production over safety, that accept risk as the cost of doing business, that treat workers as expendable parts in a machine that must never stop running. The Washburn A mill didn't have to explode. The conditions that caused that explosion weren't natural. They were created by human choices. The choice not to ventilate, the choice not to control dust, the choice to push for maximum production without understanding the consequences. Every one of those choices was made by someone who wasn't the one breathing flour paste 12 hours a day. Every one of those choices was made by someone who would survive regardless of what happened in that building. George Robinson didn't choose to work in a bomb. He chose to work in what he believed was a flour mill. Joseph Kuhn didn't emigrate from Germany to die in an explosion nobody understood. He emigrated seeking opportunity and found death instead. William Fogarty's family didn't deserve to bury fragments in a closed casket. His children deserved a father. His wife deserved a husband. They deserved the future he was working to provide. These men took jobs because they needed to support themselves and their families. They trusted that the people in charge knew what they were doing. They trusted that the buildings they entered were safe enough to enter, and that trust killed them. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty about eating bread. The flour you buy today is milled safely by workers protected by regulations that didn't exist in 1878. The industry learned its lesson. The dead of the Washburn A didn't die for nothing. But I'm telling you this because I think we owe these men something. We owe them remembrance. We owe them the recognition that every safety regulation, every dust collector, every ventilation system in every grain processing facility in the world exists because they died. Their lives purchased our safety. Their deaths funded the regulations we now take for granted. Progress demanded their lives as payment, and all we can do now is remember the transaction. And I'm telling you this because the dynamic that killed them hasn't gone away. Today, right now, there are workers in industries around the world who face risks their employers understand better than they do. There are executives making cost-benefit calculations about safety measures, weighing the price of protection against the probability of disaster, accepting certain levels of risk for certain levels of profit. There are shortcuts being taken, warnings being ignored, corners being cut. The specific industries have changed. The technology has changed. But the fundamental equation, the one that treats human beings as acceptable losses in the pursuit of production, that equation is the same today as it was in 1878. Every generation thinks its disasters are unprecedented. Every generation looks back at the past and wonders how people could have been so careless, so ignorant, so willing to accept obvious danger. And every generation fails to see the dangers in its own systems until those dangers kill people. The Washburn. A disaster wasn't unprecedented to the men who died in it. It was just the end. The unexpected, violent end to lives that deserved to continue. Lives that would have continued if anyone with the power to make changes had prioritized safety over production. 18 men walked into work on May 2, 1878. They expected to grind wheat, to earn their pay, to go home to their families when the sun came up. Instead, they became the cost of America's appetite for flour. They became the price of cheap bread. They became martyrs to an industry that didn't know it needed martyrs until they were dead. The Falls of St. Anthony still drop 50 feet. The Mississippi still flows past Minneapolis. The sun still sets amber and gold over the riverfront where the greatest flour mills on earth once stood. But the dust has settled, the fires have gone out, and the men are gone. 18 men, 3 seconds, 1 spark, and an industry forced to choose between profit and survival. The flour mill that exploded like a bomb, and the workers who paid for America's progress with everything they had. Remember them, because they're the reason your flour doesn't kill you anymore. And they deserve to be remembered. If you learned something from this video that you didn't know before, subscribe to this channel. I'll see you in the next one.